Welcome, everyone. We are privileged to have, wait, are there people in the waiting room? Oh, there's Heather. Yes. Okay. We are privileged to have Dr. Paul Ling with us this evening. Dr. Ling received his undergraduate degree at the Naval Academy and is originally from South Carolina?
Pennsylvania.
Really? What the heck?
You're going to lose the Paul Ling trivia game.
I am, honestly. I just know the important things. So Dr. Ling met his lovely wife. They were introduced by friends, and she became a Navy wife too. And Dr. Ling was a submarine officer back in the day. And then the Navy decided to send Dr. Ling, because of his amazing intellect, to Stanford University in California to get his PhD in history.
Political science.
Oh my gosh, what the heck, Paul? And Dr. Ling taught at the Naval Academy for a few years and is now back out in the civilian world, right? Your first foray.
Yes, I'm retired from the Navy and working for systems planning and analysis, a defense contractor supporting the Navy.
There you go. And they are lucky to have you.
Yes.
So Dr. Ling is going to, we gave him some information from the 401 Maritime Law syllabus, and he is going to take us through some of those things and expand on, give us some real life information as well. So if you have questions, you can put them in the chat box. If you would like to, I think Dr. Ling said he was open to you interrupting, or you can hold them till the end.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here with you all tonight. It's I'm trying to think. It's I think been about 3 years since I've been in a classroom, even virtually. So it's good to be back. To fill in one or two of the bits of my resume that Professor Selbrede may either not have known or not have felt were worth sharing. So as a submarine officer, I was assigned to 3 different attack submarines. In between those tours, I did a 2-year assignment on a destroyer squadron staff, embarked on an aircraft carrier. So I've seen most sides of the Navy except for the amphibious force. My first real shore tour was on the Joint Staff at the Pentagon in Washington, working in the Nuclear Operations Division there. And that was right about actually bookending 9/11. Then my last line shore tour before I went to grad school was at the Navy's nuclear power schoolhouse. That was in South Carolina. So I have seen, been in the Atlantic, Arctic, Pacific, Indian Oceans, and the Persian Gulf as well. So what I thought I would start off with, there was a question about what's life like on a ship. And on a submarine, at least, it's a lot like being in a camper. Not everything is quite full size. And it's very, imagine being in a camper with 140 people. So you learn to respect people's space and privacy. But it's also, being on a submarine is a lot like being in a village, because there's only 130, 140 people on board. So everybody knows everyone else. Whereas being on an aircraft carrier is like being in the big city, because there are 5,000 people on board, and I only knew probably 40 or 50 out of the 5,000. So it depends a lot what life on a ship is like, as what kind of Navy ship you're on. So as a watch officer on submarines, aircraft carriers, and destroyers, you know, at the time, my view of international law or maritime law was pretty simple. There's not that much that you need to know in order to drive where the captain tells you to drive and do what you're supposed to do and occasionally talk on the radio. There is, in fact, a book called the Commander's Handbook of the Law of Naval Operations. I think I shared that with you, Cecilia. It's a PDF naval warfare publication.
Okay, yes.
I'll send it to you after. But so that goes through, and it, you know, talks in about 5 pages. It goes through the law of the sea. Another 5 pages are on law of port visits, and then it starts getting into the law of armed conflict and what in legal terms would be called international humanitarian law. So it's, again, international law, which can be a very complicated subject. The basic concepts tend to be fairly simple, but as soon as you start making specific facts into a case, it can get complicated pretty quickly. But as a watch officer, I really didn't see any of that. And most admirals who are out at sea in command, they're the ones who are really making the kind of decisions of that have big legal implications. And they all have an assigned judge advocate general, a Navy lawyer working with them who's been specially trained in a good bit more detail than most of his line officer advisors. So ask the JAG is one of the first questions typically that comes up when there is a legal question during operations. Now, in a submarine, though, one of the twists is that you don't have the JAG on a submarine, and you can't talk to him by radio because you're usually in radio silence trying to be stealthy. But usually then you also have fewer international legal issues to deal with. So I'll start off, and I'm going to try and share my screen here with Google Earth. And I will talk about I'm working on the screen share. Can you all see Google Earth?
No.
Now?
No.
Give it time.
Trying to share my screen. Oh. Hang on, I gotta. Oh my heavens. It's asking me to open my computer preferences. So that's too hard. I don't want to waste your time. So everybody can pull out their phones and Google Strait of Hormuz in Google Maps, and you'll be able to see what I'm talking about.
Oh, okay.
So the
oh, maybe I should try that.
But the Strait of Hormuz is an interesting and very busy place. It is, if you can imagine, a busy interstate highway with a bunch of semi-trailers loaded with fuel going back and forth on both sides. And to be a submarine in the Strait of Hormuz, you're essentially, now imagine yourself on a little tricycle tootling around trying not to get run over. That's what it feels like to be submerged in the Strait of Hormuz. But the advantage of being a submarine is that most other ships can't see you unless they're very, very close, or you're on the surface, or you make a big mistake. But the surface ships that go through the Strait of Hormuz have to use, you can't get through this Strait of Hormuz without going into Iranian territorial waters. So Iran has been unfriendly to the United States for my entire Navy career, and it doesn't look like that's going to change anytime soon. So the question, you know, that occasional, I would always pull that fact out to kind of give my watch team shivers and impress them. And the question comes up, so how can we drive through Iran's territorial waters? How can we go into Iran and without breaking the law, without Iranian permission? And the answer to that is that there's something called transit passage in the United Nations Law of the Sea Convention, which was specifically designed, there we go, thank you, to allow you to go through that narrow spot where the red dot is, which is half Oman, half Iran. And there's a teeny little triangle just off to that that's further than 12 miles from both countries, which is the only international waters in the entire strait. But the answer, as I'm sure you guys know or will learn, is that it's called transit passage, which exists specifically to give seagoing nations the right to go through a coastal state's territorial seas to get from one part of an exclusive economic zone or high seas to another. And so the Iranians would typically, when they saw a column of U.S. ships going through the Strait of Hormuz, they would call up on the radio and say, U.S. warship in the Strait of Hormuz, this is Iranian warship 55 or something from a little patrol boat. And the officer of the deck on the Navy ship would answer back on the radio, this is U.S. warship 72. I'm conducting transit passage in accordance with international law. And usually that would be it because the Iranians didn't normally want to start a fight on any given night going through the Strait of Hormuz. But we were relying on international law, and so were the Iranians. So one of the other things, though, that if you were, the answer to the Iranian radio challenge would depend on where you were. So if you went a little further and you went outside that band of Iranian territorial waters and into what was then the exclusive economic zone of Iran, we could legally operate in the exclusive economic zone, but we didn't say exclusive economic zone. We would say international waters, because as a naval officer, you're taught anything outside 12 nautical miles, the limit of the territorial sea, is international waters. But if you look in the Law of the Sea Convention, it doesn't say anything about international waters. And one of my bosses at the time, first time I went through the Strait of Hormuz, said he had talked with an Indonesian naval officer when he was at the Naval War College. They were classmates. And Indonesia has lots and lots of straits. And the Indonesian officer said, you Americans in your international waters, there's no such thing. Look at the treaty. And to a certain extent, he was right. But at the same time, oh, we're drifting off into India there.
No, did you want?
Oh, you were going to Indonesia. Got it.
Okay.
Sorry. I just squirrel with a shiny object.
My people were calling.
The point was that the United States, and that was kind of my introduction to the fact that the United States has a little bit of a unique application to the law of the sea. The treaty that it's based on was signed in 1982. At the time, the United States made a big deal out of not signing it because we were concerned with a couple of fairly far future rules about undersea mining. And eventually, in the 1990s, the relevant portion of the treaty was rewritten so that the United States and Great Britain and a couple of other Western seafaring nations could approve of the undersea mining things. And the United States finally signed it in 1994, 95, something like that. That's good. Yeah, stay right there. Singapore and the Strait of Malacca. So the United States has signed the treaty, but the Senate has not ratified it in 25 years since then. And a couple of times, the Navy very much wants the United States, the Senate, to ratify this treaty, but there are enough senators who have concerns with what they think is either a socialistic regime for the undersea mining in the seabed, or they just think that the International Tribunal of the Law of the Sea, International Court, is too restrictive and infringes on U.S. sovereignty. So ever since 1982, the Navy has relied on a lot of the passages of the Law of the Sea Treaty, even though our government hasn't ratified it. And the workaround that the Department of State says is, well, the United States considers that the Law of the Sea reflects customary international law for all of the things that we like, but not for the things that we don't like. So it's a little bit strange, and I guess I'm free to criticize the government now because I don't work for it directly anymore. But it is, countries that have signed and ratified the treaty sometimes are frustrated that the United States relies on it without undertaking all of its obligations itself. So second, one of the other, and I'm going to shift gears here to a new topic about boarding other countries' vessels or flagged vessels. And by and large, and I think we'll kind of use the example right now of the Ever Given, the monster container ship that got stuck in the Suez Canal last month. So and this is really, the Ever Given is kind of a snapshot of how multinational or global the international maritime industry is. So the ship is actually owned by a Japanese company. The Japanese company chartered it, long-term rental, basically, to a Taiwanese shipping company called the Evergreen Line. So it says Evergreen on the side of the ship. The crew were mostly Indian, who were all hired by I think it was a German ship management firm, and they were going through the Suez Canal, which is internal waters of Egypt. So I think we're at 6 or 7 countries, depending on how you count. So and I think it was registered in Panama or Liberia, both of which are very small, generally poor countries who make a buck by licensing as very cheap what are called flag of convenience. So if you registered a ship like that in the United States, US law would say you have to have a US national crew, very expensive. You have to maintain Coast Guard safety certifications, also expensive. If you go to Liberia, they don't care who crews your ship. You just pay the money and you're good to go. You can fly the Liberian flag and enjoy all the protection it conveys. But all the protection it conveys. So if you think back 10 years ago, I'm trying to do my math right. Yeah, roughly 10 years ago to the beginning of the Obama administration, when the US flagged vessel Maersk Alabama was hijacked by Somali pirates. Everybody see the movie Captain Phillips? But so the hijacking of the Maersk Alabama was a big deal because it was an American registered vessel, which meant the US Navy showed up and cared. And you had SEAL snipers ready to shoot all the hijackers when the moment was right. Liberian flagged vessel, not so much. But just in general, boarding flagged vessels can only be done on the high seas, can only be done with the consent of the flag state. So
Yes, registered Panama.
Yeah, correct. And so that if the Coast Guard is trying to do drug interdictions, for instance, a lot depends on what the flag or the claimed flag of the vessel they want to board is, and does the United States have a good relationship? In many cases, some countries have given pre-authorization to the Coast Guard to conduct a board. So at that point, they just say it's, Greek flagged. So Greece has allowed the United States to board in its waters without having to explicitly ask permission. So the Coast Guard boarding team can just go. If it is a country that has not granted that permission, then as long as it's on the high seas, the United States lacks the authority to do so. Now, there are other conditions as well. On my first time in the Persian Gulf in 1995, the UN Security Council still had sanctions, economic sanctions on Iraq to try and keep its weapons of mass destruction program from developing. So the only Iraqi oil that could be sold was through a UN licensed program that took the money and made sure it was used for food rather than for nuclear weapons components. So there was money to be made smuggling Iraqi oil out of Iraq and selling it on the world market. So in this particular case, vessels that were coming out of Iraq, the UN Security Council had passed a resolution that authorized coalition forces, basically the United States and its allies, to stop them and inspect to ensure that no violation of sanctions or smuggling was going on. And that's a fairly special case. But in most cases, you either have to, the vessel has to be in your territorial sea, or it has to be with the consent of the flag state. I will say that I do not know much about the mechanics of boarding. That's I will say that I think in the last 20 years or so, particularly post 9/11, it has gone away from just a bunch of sailors in working uniforms driving across, and it's become more like a SWAT team where they go, board heavily armed, wearing body armor, and a lot of guns in evidence when it happens. But that's usually on a presumption that they were looking for terrorists or that they were supplying other kind of arms smuggling or things like that. I don't know what drug interdiction boarding, say in the Caribbean or the Pacific, are like. The Coast Guard basically taught the Navy how to do boardings, so I suspect the Coast Guard probably makes sure that they have guns visible when they do it. And the parent ship is always in a position out of the line of fire of the small boat doing the boarding to provide support.
Did you?
Does that
mind?
answer whoever asked the question about boarding protocols?
I don't remember who asked. There is a question too.
Okay.
You mentioned that in high seas we must have permission of the flag state. What about boarding in high seas after hot pursuit?
Oh, yeah, that's an exception. So if you're fleeing from territorial waters, and there's also the contiguous zone, which is the 12 miles immediately outside the territorial sea that a coastal state may, but need not, issue some specific regulations for things like environmental protection or law enforcement, in addition to the 12-mile territorial sea. But hot pursuit leaving the territorial sea is an exception to, if they're required to admit boarding in the territorial sea and then they try to abscond, hot pursuit is authorized. And I think there's sort of a limit. It doesn't mean it has to be continuous, so that, you know, if they get away and then you find them, you know, 2 weeks later, 1,000 miles away, you can't just say, "Oh, we're continuing the pursuit," and board away.
Oh, good grief. I lost Indonesia. I'm so sorry.
That's all right. All right, so maritime zones, and you know, now is actually as good a time as any. Get a big picture. Wow, that you're down to individual pixels now. South China Sea.
South China Sea.
Yep.
South China Sea, right here.
Yep, there you go. So that's perfect. Don't go any, or zoom out a smidge. So the South China Sea is particularly interesting from the legal standpoint in that, you know, it's got Vietnam, China, the Philippines, Taiwan, plus Brunei, Malaysia, and Indonesia and Singapore, all kind of ringing the body of water. And it is, in most cases, not 400 miles across. So everybody's, if you go out 200 miles from each coast, you get a bunch of overlapping exclusive economic zones. There are also, and you can see in the picture, little islands and reefs. And the distinction is important under maritime law, because an island is capable of having a territorial sea and an exclusive economic zone. A reef or a rock, or even, you know, what's called a low tide feature, which is something that's only above water when the tide is low, is not entitled to have a territorial sea or an exclusive economic zone. And the Chinese have gone on an ambitious program of claiming almost the entire South China Sea, except for a little coastal strip for all the countries, on very weak grounds. But they've also taken these rocks or reefs and brought in huge dredging units and built man-made islands. But the, you know, the law of the sea is fairly explicit that you can't build an island. A man-made feature is not entitled to claim a territorial sea or economic zone. The other thing that's kind of interesting about the South China Sea is that it actually used it was one of the most important cases of the International Law of the Sea Tribunal in Hamburg, where the Philippines took China to court, claiming that China had unlawful or unwarranted territorial claims, but then even if you conceded the territorial claims, they were trying to make additional derivations of territorial claims from reefs. And the tribunal, China essentially denied jurisdiction, that the court had jurisdiction, and walked out. The tribunal ended up finding in favor of the Philippines, at least partially. They said that, well, we're not going to make a claim on the territorial of who owns the Paracel Islands or the Spratly Islands or South Thomas Shoal or any of these other, you know, miserable fly-specked rocks. But we do say that China's particular claims of territorial sea and economic zones from uninhabited rocks or shoals are not valid. But that hasn't stopped China from doing it. Which then kind of brings up the couple of other examples. So you ready to go further north now? Too hot in the South China Sea?
I will try.
Let's go up to the Arctic and see if it's
Oh.
really a globe or if it's a flat map.
Oh my goodness.
So in the Arctic, with climate change, the polar ice is much less in extent and thickness than it was a generation ago or historically. So there we go. Good, that's perfect. So what Google Earth doesn't show is that most of that deep blue part of the Arctic is currently ice covered. But the route across the top of Norway and across the top of Russia and then through the Bering Strait into the Pacific by Alaska is called the Northern Sea Route. And the Russians have made claims to that are, they think that it's a little bit shorter than going via Suez to get from China to Europe if you take the Northern Sea Route than if you go through the Strait of Malacca and Suez. A couple days shorter, which in a low margin business like cargo shipping is a big deal. So the Russians, I think the first time they did the Arctic Sea Route was probably in the 1940s or 50s when it was a lot icier. And all they did was send through a specially ice hardened merchant ship with a couple of really big icebreakers in front of it blocking. So it was not economically viable or important. It was just kind of a political stunt. But as the ice gets thinner and the Northern Sea Route is actually navigable much of the summer now. And with continued projections of loss of the polar ice cap, it may become navigable almost year round. And the Russians think that that's a big opportunity for them to make money. And in particular, one of their angles, I think, is going to be environmental protection. So if you want to drive your container ship or your oil tanker around the Northern Sea Route, you're going to be, the ice is going to keep you in the Russian exclusive economic zone. And at some points, it may even keep you into the contiguous zone or the territorial sea. So the Russians have said that they will require any vessel using the Northern Sea Route to get permission from the Russians. Well, if you need an icebreaker to escort you, which a lot of the time you do now, it's reasonable that you pay the Russians for the icebreaker services. But the United States has a problem with coastal states making claims of that kind, and it would probably not surprise me if at some point we did a freedom of navigation operation there, driving a destroyer through. Now, the problem is that most U.S. Navy destroyers are not Arctic hardened, so we might end up having to pay the Russians for the icebreaker anyway. But that's that last bit was speculation there. But the last, that brings up another point of the Navy's Freedom of Navigation Operations Program. And the basic idea here is that if you have a legal right, but you don't exercise it against a bogus claim, then over time you can surrender that right by not using it. So particularly in the South China Sea, but also in Iran, and just last week, apparently, we did one in India, and I haven't seen the specifics on that, but presumably India is claiming more than the Department of State and the Navy think they should at some point. So the Navy sent a destroyer to drive into the contested area and say, no, it's not your coastal waters, it's the high seas or international waters.
It's like adverse possession. That's crazy.
Yeah, well, I mean, and now the Navy does this a lot in the Pacific, but we do it all around the world too. And there are Russian examples of Russian claims that are excessive too. But in fact, the State Department has a actual book that is a reference of all the they have a listing of all states' territorial claims for the oceans, including those that they say the United States does not recognize. So the next thing I want to talk about is something I've actually working with early this morning, in fact, which is marine scientific research. And this is a kind of a little niche piece, but it's interesting in that it shows the interplay between this time with the United States as a coastal state for a change instead of the seafaring state, but the law of the sea, and how a lot of countries actually cooperate in the administration of this marine scientific research system. So the basic, one of the articles of the Law of the Sea Treaty, or it's actually like 3 or 4 of them, talk about marine scientific research. So if I want to go study whales in the high seas, I can go and do it. I don't need to ask anyone's permission. But if I want to go study whales in, say, the Russian exclusive economic zone in the Arctic, I can't do it without the coastal state's permission. But the coastal state just can't capriciously or arbitrarily say no. It has to say yes, unless there's a series of specifically enumerated criteria that would justify it to say no. And that's that it's, I think I forget all of the criteria, but one of them I think is, it's a kind of a destructive sort of research, or it may contaminate the environment. Another is that the research state is supposed to provide a copy of the data and any conclusions to the coastal state. And if there's been a previous case where they don't come back within a reasonable time with the data that was gathered, then that can be a grounds for saying no on a future request. But the State Department has essentially a computerized database for processing these requests. And the request I was looking at this morning was for South Korean oceanographers who wanted to work in the Bering Sea, between Alaska and Russia, and then the Arctic Ocean up on the northern side of the Bering Sea. So it was, by and large, it was a pretty routine request. They weren't going to do anything destructive, but for those areas of research where they wanted to do research and it was within 200 miles of the US coast, they had to get US government permission. So they had to ask 6 months in advance and so forth. But the State Department created an automated web database called RATS. And I think the R is research, but I don't know what the rest is. But it turned out that RATS was so popular for countries wanting to do research in the US that other countries, the State Department shared the software with them. So basically, the State Department runs what is almost a global database for research requests where, if you wanted to go if the South Koreans wanted to go do research in the Russian exclusive economic zone, they would file their request in the Department of State's RATS system. So that's an interesting example of cooperation. So you might ask the question then, well, what about military oceanographic research? Is that authorized? And the answer to that depends on what country you ask. So China, for instance, does not like the United States military doing hydrographic, meaning charting, or oceanographic data collection in the South China Sea. Because they have a number of military bases there and it's a politically sensitive area. But to the point where Chinese government and probably militia vessels have harassed American ships doing research in the Chinese exclusive economic zone. But the U.S. position is that, hey, military hydrographic survey work is entirely separate. It's not under the marine scientific research, which deals with only civilian research. So it is U.S. Navy ships can go anywhere as long as they couldn't, like the U.S. Navy couldn't go drill for oil in the Chinese exclusive economic zone. But if they're just collecting oceanographic or survey data, that is permitted according to the U.S. government. So I'm not sure if I have just lost everybody on Monday night here. I'm hoping that this is interesting and not just a boring stream of consciousness. So please ask some questions.
Okay, can I get out of Google Earth? Because I can't see the chat box.
Yes, although
Okay.
the number is still 3.
What number?
But yes, we're done with Google Earth.
Okay, good. Oh, now I have to figure out how to unshare. Oh, stop share. Genius. Okay.
At least you didn't kill the Zoom while you did it.
Yeah, exactly. So Heather Bradley said, not at all boring. Thank you, Dr. Ling.
Oh, okay.
Well,
3 bonus points for Heather.
And Jenna asked a question, so
okay.
she gets points too. No, we already read it. That was Hot Pursuit. But if anyone has a question, you can unmute and ask, please.
All right, because the next thing I'm planning to talk about is maritime security law, which, are any of your students in the Coast Guard?
Are any of you in the Coast Guard? I thought one of you was. Are you, Justin? That's what I was trying to ask you when you're...
Army.
Army, okay.
Excellent, all right, good. I feel better then. So I did not want to presume, I was going to go on thin ice because maritime security law in the United States is largely the role of the Coast Guard and, many cases, federal or state law enforcement. So, but, the best way to think about maritime security law, I think, is in, threats to ships and ports within the coastal state's jurisdiction. Maritime security law, you're not normally talking about, the Iranians challenging the U.S. Navy in the Strait of Hormuz, although I guess maybe the Iranians would say it's their maritime security law. But I think from the U.S. perspective, that is more a function of domestic law. And because foreign vessels coming into U.S. waters are subject to coastal state regulation there, it's it's legally binding on them. So I can think of a couple of safety examples. So one is the United States has created since 9/11 has basically created a standoff security zone around U.S. Warships in U.S. waters. So and I don't recall the exact specifics, but it's essentially you need to stay outside, I think of like, I forget the distance, I think 200 yards, maybe more than that, of a U.S. warship, just as a force protection measure for the ships. Because a ship, particularly if you're in a narrow channel or shallow water, the speed and the weapons of a warship are designed to protect it in the open ocean, not when it's driving in and out of port. By the same token, a lot of times there will be a Navy or a Coast Guard escort boat, usually with big machine guns promptly displayed, that helps to reinforce that kind of message. But it applies also, to a number of other kind of potential threats. Again, right after 9/11, one of the concerns was that if Al-Qaeda got a nuclear weapon or even access to just radioactive material, they would smuggle a bomb inside a shipping container. And I think at the time, like 2% of containers coming into the United States were actually opened and inspected by customs. And if you open up the container that has the atomic bomb in it, it's probably a bit late. So some of the regulations that were increased there were, if you wanted to bring a container ship into a U.S. port, you always had to provide a copy of the bill of lading of what cargo you were carrying. But it became much more rigorous and detailed, and the United States created relationships with consigning shipping companies at the foreign port who were trusted agents who would say, yes, the container ship coming into Long Beach Harbor with 5,000 containers is actually, those containers say what was loaded in Shanghai, and that's trusted information. Another kind of thing is specific high value or very vulnerable needs, like liquid natural gas terminals are an example. So if you Google like an LNG tanker, what you see is it's this big tanker with what looks like igloos or domes built on top. Well, that's a ship that's carrying liquefied natural gas in these gigantic spherical tanks, and it's refrigerated down to 20 degrees above absolute zero or something ridiculous like that to keep it all liquid. But the amount of energy that's stored there is so high that if that ship caught fire or exploded, it would effectively be like a nuclear bomb going off. So liquid natural gas vessels get particular safety and security inspections and attention when they come in. And the same thing for the liquid natural gas terminals where they dock. Those are not in the middle of populated locations. There's one on Chesapeake Bay, just about 3 or 4 miles from Calvert Cliffs Nuclear Station.
Oh, God.
And I used to go sailing on the Chesapeake Bay by there, and it's lit up, and there's a big marking on the chart, stay well clear of the terminal, even when there aren't any ships there. Another security law, and this is kind of more on the failure side, is the Beirut harbor explosion last summer. How many of you remember seeing that incredible video footing of this explosion in Beirut? So what happened was there was and again, this is kind of how the gaps in international regulation for a lot of maritime activity created a big tragedy. So the story was that a Ukrainian or Russian flagged, rust bucket freighter was carrying a couple thousand tons of ammonium nitrate, which is a standard fertilizer, but it's also, the #1 ingredient in making truck bombs. The Oklahoma City bombing in 1995 was an ammonium nitrate bomb. So, but it also has a legitimate commercial use. So the freighter that was taking ammonium nitrate stopped in Beirut to unload some other cargo, and then there was a legal dispute where between the ship owner and the owner of the cargo or something. So the ship ended up in limbo. It was tied up to a pier in Beirut Harbor for like 2 years, to the point where the rust in the rust bucket started giving way, and they were worried that it was going to sink alongside the pier. So they offloaded all the ammonium nitrate, 5,000 tons or whatever, put it in a warehouse, and right in the middle of downtown Beirut.
Oh my God.
And then they had somebody put some seized fireworks in the next next warehouse over, a fire started there, and you end up with a huge tragedy. So but again, it's the kind of the gaps or the seams and the absolute ruthless drive to rock bottom in safety and cost in the maritime industry that can cause that kind of thing. Another is the Suez Canal. So the classic case of the container ship getting stuck there. Egypt requires, how am I doing on time?
We're good.
Okay.
8 minutes.
Egypt requires that any ship going through the canal, which takes, I think, on the order of 18 or 20 hours to go the full distance, has to have 2 Suez Canal pilots on board, Egyptians. And although the law says they assume no responsibility for the vessel or whatever, they're just advisors to the captain who retains sole responsibility.
Of course.
The Panama Canal, however, it's the opposite. The pilots are actually, the captain has to give control of the ship to the pilots.
Oh, wow.
And he has to follow their direction. They're not just advisors. And that's one of the 2 times when, if a U.S. Navy ship goes aground, the captain isn't necessarily responsible if the Panama Canal pilot made a mistake. But when the U.S. Navy goes through, and an aircraft carrier went through the Suez Canal, I think about a week or 2 after it reopened, following the grounding, again, the ship is extremely vulnerable in a narrow channel. It has no ability to maneuver. It's just going in a straight line following the channel. But at that point, there's an agreement between the United States and the Egyptian government to provide adequate Egyptian military security around the ship, U.S. ships as they go through. But the U.S. ships also keep their own weapons ready to go. But you certainly don't want to be the American ship captain who thinks in self-defense he has to use his weapons and then have a machine gun kill a bunch of people on the what turns out to be a fishing boat or ashore. Okay, so if we got 6 minutes left, I have 2 topics that I haven't really talked about. One is migrants and safety, and the other is piracy. Is there a preference which we should do first?
Anyone have a preference? Can you just unmute?
Yeah. Oh, wait. There's a point.
2 migrants.
1-to-1 tie between pirates and migrants.
No, 2 migrants, 1 piracy.
All right. Pirates lose. Well, I'll do the migrants, and I'll stick around extra if the pirates want to ask. So migrants, again, is an interesting case where you have coastal state rights and duties balancing against the migrants, typically migrant smugglers. But a lot of times, there aren't necessarily migrant smugglers, and the migrants are just trying to move on their own. So I think kind of the major examples that I can think of were seaborne migrants coming to the United States. I think in the last 30 years has been either generally tend to be Cubans or Haitians. And in the 1990s, when I was actually operating in the Caribbean, there was a different set of American policy rules for Cuban migrants versus Haitian migrants. The Cubans were viewed as, people trying to seek freedom, leaving a communist-dominated oppressive state. And there was a large and politically powerful Cuban-American community in the United States. So if you were a Cuban migrant who was stopped on the high seas, you would be returned to Cuba. But if you made it through, and this was called the wet foot, dry foot policy, where if you made it to the United States, you would be permitted to stay as a refugee. Haitians they weren't as well connected with the Haitian community in the United States, wasn't as politically powerful. So the Haitians, regardless of whether they reached land or not, tended to get returned to Haiti. So the other major example you can think of is in Europe. So the EU has a large, particularly about 5 years ago, they had a huge problem with Syrian and Afghan and Iraqi refugees traveling overland through Turkey and then trying to jump these 3 or 4 mile straits between mainland Turkey and these Greek islands immediately off the Turkish coast. And once they got ashore in Greece, they were in the European Union and they could go anywhere within the common border area. Well, the migrant flow got so enormous that eventually, Greece was being overrun. They were not able to care for these thousands and thousands of, really wretched refugees coming through. But the EU did it as a collective problem. So the EU did something similar to what the United States did with Mexico under the Trump administration, which is, okay, if you've got refugees coming through Turkey to get to Greece, we want the Turks to crack down and keep them in Turkey. They can apply for refugee status, but they have to stay in Turkey. And that dramatically reduced the number of migrants making it through into Europe. Roughly the same time, though, there were also African migrants trying to cross the entire Mediterranean. And that was a much more dangerous passage, obviously, because, it's 100, 150 miles wide and it's an ocean, not just, you're crossing like crossing a river or a lake. So the upshot there, though, was the European Union wanted to discourage the migrants from coming because there were all these horrific stories of, smugglers trying to run people across in grossly overloaded boats. If it rained, the boat would start to flood and sink. So the smugglers would throw some of the migrants overboard to, just awful. But they also didn't want unlimited number of economic migrants coming from, in a lot of cases, sometimes they were Libyan refugees from the Civil War, but in many cases they were coming from even further south in Africa, going north through Libya to reach Europe. And the legal piece here is that it's a mix between a humanitarian legal obligation, a duty to render assistance at sea. If you see a vessel in distress, all vessels are supposed to help, versus the coastal state's right to control its borders and regulate immigration. And it's so a lot depends on where the migrants are relative to the coastal state, and also kind of what sort of patrols or legal regimes are in place to kind of regulate or stop the flow. So that's the migrants piece. If there are any questions there, I'll be happy to address them. Otherwise, I'll go on to piracy.
It's, oh, okay. It is 9:01.
Okay, well, you want to cut it off here, or? I mean, I'm happy to go a little bit longer, but I don't want to keep anyone who's working late.
Do you, I don't, no one signed off. So assuming people are still listening, then go ahead on piracy.
I see 11 in the chat. Is that just all people saying horrible things about the smugglers throwing migrants overboard?
No, that was the debate between migrants and pirates.
Pirates, okay.
Yeah, you're good.
Okay, so piracy is, best way to think about piracy is it's just crime committed at sea. So the Somali pirates are probably the most recent, or most famous recent example, although Somali piracy has definitely reduced in scale to what it was 10 years ago. But that's because a number of things have happened. And I'll talk about those in a second. But I remember there was a question about, hey, how come coastal states aren't willing to try pirates? And, that's a good question. But, think about it from the standpoint of if you are a poor Indian Ocean coastal state. And, the United States took the pirates from the Maersk, Alabama, that, the ones who weren't shot by the SEALs, and took them to try them in federal court in New York. But, the United States does not want to assume the responsibility and expense of feeding, housing, caring for, trying, and then imprisoning, every random Somali pirate. And that's both because it's an expense. The United States has the authority to do so, since piracy is a universal jurisdiction crime. So Congress can certainly create a law that says, hey, we will try every pirate on the high seas that we can catch. But, there's really very little desire to do it. So the other thing for coastal states is, in many cases, well, I'm not going to make excuses for pirates, but if you look at kind of the rhetoric or justification that the Somali pirates themselves used, they said, we're just poor Somali fishermen whose waters have been polluted by ships passing by, dumping oil and garbage, hurting our fishing grounds. We have, big deep sea industrial fishing vessels coming from other countries, depleting our fish, fish stocks. So we had no choice but to take up piracy. It's kind of our way of, maintaining our livelihood after foreign shipping has destroyed our livelihood as fishermen. So there's probably some truth to that, but you can also say that we're not interested in having, holding things for ransom. So,
sorry.
Go ahead.
Well, plus part of that expense also, once they capture the pirates and they're going to try them, they also have to provide counsel for them.
Yeah.
Because they're afforded all the rights of that state.
Yeah, exactly. So, it's not cheap to, and, what, so some coastal states also are, probably looking the other way because they just don't want to offend the local groups who are, supplying the pirates too. Or you could even be more cynical and say that, well, they're, some of the more corrupt governments that say the government officials are in the piracy racket themselves. So, because again, pirates are a lot, or at least I think the Somali pirates are a lot like, a drug cartel. There are a lot of dirt poor triggermen who are taking the real risks for chump change, while the big guys up the chain are the ones bringing in the profits.
Yes.
So, there's, it's kind of like arresting the drug mule versus going after the cartel boss.
Okay, Heather has a question. May I read it to you?
Yes.
Okay, my questions for Dr. Ling are: one, what are the U.S. and/or international options for dealing with China's aggressiveness in the South China Sea and the buildup of their Navy?
Well, the buildup of the Navy is entirely legal. So we can either build more than them or accept it. And given, our budget priorities right now, I think we're going to kind of be accepting it. So as far as Chinese activities in the South China Sea, they've been, it's if you listen to the State Department spokesman or the White House spokesman or even a Navy PR flack, they'll spend a lot of time talking about, freedom of the seas and the rules-based international order. Wow, that's a hill I want to die on. So, but to be facetious, the rules-based international order is one where the Chinese say, hey, the Americans and the Europeans came up with those rules. They benefit them, not us. We don't want to totally demolish the international order. We just want to renegotiate it a little bit. So, and the example in the South China Sea is that they are not infringing on U.S. territorial claims. So, are you willing to start a shooting war with China over some, humid tropical rock that's uninhabitable without spending a whole lot of money, which the Chinese are willing to do because it's in their neighborhood, they care, and push comes to shove, they can always intimidate the Vietnamese or the Filipinos who are a lot poorer than they are. So the problem is, I think the U.S. approach right now has been to largely say, we are going to reject the bogus extensions of territorial and exclusive economic zone claims from these uninhabitable rocks. But the United States has said, we're neutral on the sovereignty dispute. So the habitable rock islands, the United States doesn't have a position on who they belong to. And, like most other things with China, China is a very powerful country whose cooperation the United States wants in a lot of different areas. And are we willing to pick a fight on grounds where they care a lot more than we do? And it's an unsatisfying answer, but it's kind of where we are, in my opinion.
Thank you.
Wow, that actually talked about my last bullet, which was the rules-based international order.
There you go. You're just that good.
All right. So, any other questions? I'm happy to answer. If not, I will not extend.
I actually have a question.
Yes.
In your professional and personal opinion, I guess, you were mentioning the Ever Given being stuck in the Suez Canal.
Mm-hmm.
My husband and I own a flooring business, and it is
a what business?
A flooring business.
Oh, okay.
Floor covering.
Yep.
It was about $2,000 to get a container shipped from China. It is going up to $12,000. Do you believe that has something to do with the Ever Given or more of a political issue?
I think there may be an Ever Given piece of that, but I think my understanding is right now that the pandemic has distorted trade flows. That's not to say that the Chinese aren't exporting thousands and thousands upon thousands of shipping containers every day, but from what I understand, some of the pandemic-induced changes in demand and supply have resulted in empty containers piling up in some places without a correspond where they can't get the empty containers back to China so they can refill them with Chinese goods and send them back. So that, I think, may be part of the problem. I think the Egyptians right now, once the Ever Given got free, there's a lake halfway through the Suez Canal, and the Ever Given was on the southern stretch going north towards the middle of the lake, or towards the lake in the middle. So when they pulled it off the side and the tugs took it up to the lake, and then they did the safety inspections to see how much the ship was damaged, the Egyptians immediately forbade the ship to sail from their port until the Japanese owner of the ship, paid him $1 billion in restitution for the extraction. I mean, that must have been one really expensive backhoe operator. But plus the loss of tolls, which I think was on the order of $10 or $20 million a day. Now, I'm not sure how you get from $20 million a day for a week to $1 billion, but you know, they're essentially holding the ship hostage now,
Yeah.
including the poor Indian crew,
Yeah.
you know, who, well, they, you know, maybe the captain contributed to the grounding, but most of the guys on the ship probably didn't. As far as, do I think a tenfold increase in shipping costs is due to the Ever Given? It depends on the route taken. The Suez Canal is primarily going from Asia to Europe and the Persian Gulf to Europe and vice versa. Most, if your roofing or flooring materials are coming from China, then they're probably coming in the US West Coast or maybe through the Panama Canal into the East Coast. So there may be other market forces at play, and I'm not enough of an expert to really parse out where that cost went. But it, you know, the increase in shipping costs, even you know, just trucking in the U.S., freight rates are going up. Fortunately, Amazon hasn't passed that on to me yet. Did that answer
Thank
your question,
I
Jen?
appreciate that. Yes, it did. It just to give me a little bit more insight. So I do appreciate that.
Okay. I think we're good, right? Anyone else? Okay. Well, thank you, Dr. Ling.
All right. You're welcome. Thank you very much for having me. I enjoyed it. And
Yeah, it's great. Me.
and if anybody has any last minute reattack questions, just send them to me by email.
I shall. I'll send them on to you. Thank you so much. And we appreciate your time.